The era of the bolt-action rifle is officially dead in the Sahel. Not gradually, not theoretically, dead right now. In 2026, while the world watched traditional insurgencies play out across Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger through the familiar lens of ground skirmishes, ambushed convoys, and the grinding, inconclusive patrols that defined 2 decades of conventional counter-terrorism in this theater, something else was happening, quietly, precisely, at altitudes that no armed motorcycle convoy can reach and no desert landscape can conceal from. Russian Orlan-10 surveillance drones and Lancet loitering munitions were rewriting the rules of African warfare from above, and the insurgent groups that have operated in the vast, unmonitored topographical gaps of the Sahelian tri-border zone for over a decade, groups whose entire tactical model was built on the assumption that the terrain would always protect them, are discovering that the terrain they trusted has become the environment that exposes them. The hide-and-seek war that armed groups perfected across 30 million square kilometers of open Sahel is colliding with technology that sees everything, remembers everything, and strikes with a precision that bolt-action rifles and ambush tactics have no answer for. Witness how high-tech precision is dismantling decades of insurgent doctrine and reclaiming sovereignty in the most volatile corridor on the African continent. Because what is happening in the Sahelian tri-border zone in 2026 is not just a military campaign, it is a demonstration, a proof of concept, a live-fire laboratory where a new African defense model is being tested and validated in conditions more demanding than any military exercise could replicate, and the results are changing everything. To understand the scale of the transformation, you need to understand what Sahelian counterterrorism looked like before 2023. Walk into any military base in the tri-border zone during the previous decade and you find the same picture. Soldiers equipped with weapons whose design lineage traces back to colonial-era arsenals, bolt-action rifles, aging assault weapons maintained past their operational service life because replacement budgets never arrived, vehicles built for road surfaces that the operational environment does not provide, communication equipment that insurgents had learned to monitor, jam, or exploit through a decade of patient observation, and patrol, doctrine that had not fundamentally evolved since the French military designed it for a colonial security context that bears no meaningful resemblance to a 21st century counterterrorism campaign against adaptive, mobile, technologically aware armed groups. The result was a military that operated primarily in 2 dimensions, forward and back, left and right, in an environment where the enemy moved in all 3. Insurgent groups in the Sahelian tri-border zone achieved tactical dominance not through superior weapons but through superior use of terrain and superior information. They knew where military patrols operated. They knew patrol schedules because patrol schedules in under-resourced military environments become predictable faster than commanders typically acknowledge. They knew the topographical features, the wadis, the rock formations, the degraded tree lines that provided cover for rapid assembly, attack, and dispersal before any response could be coordinated. They owned the information environment, and in a conflict where information is the decisive resource, owning the information environment is equivalent to owning the battlefield. The foreign military partners who were supposed to address this imbalance, the French Operation Barkhane, the American Special Operations Presence, the European training missions, arrived with technology that they controlled, intelligence that they processed through their own systems, and operational data that stayed in their command networks rather than flowing to the Malian, Burkinabe, and Nigerian commanders who needed it to fight their own war. The AES nations were being defended by foreign intelligence that they could not access, foreign technology that they could not operate independently, and foreign strategic priorities that did not always align with theirs. That arrangement ends with the political changes of 2021 through 2023, and what replaces it is rewriting the Sahelian security landscape from the ground up, starting from 3,000 meters above it. The Orlan-10 is not a glamorous piece of military hardware. It does not appear in action movie sequences. It does not generate the kind of of dramatic visual content that defense industry marketing departments build campaigns around. It is a medium-altitude, long-endurance surveillance platform with a wingspan of approximately 3.5 meters, an operational ceiling that keeps it invisible and inaudible from the ground, and an endurance of 16 to 18 hours that allows it to monitor a target area continuously through an entire operational cycle, from the initial movement of a convoy to the final dispersal of its personnel without returning to base. And that endurance is the capability that changes everything about counterinsurgency in the Sahel. Previous aerial surveillance of the tri-border zone depended on assets with operational windows measured in hours. Aircraft that arrived over a target area, collected what they could see in the available time, and departed before the full picture of enemy movement had developed. Insurgent groups learned the timing of these windows with the same patient observation that taught them patrol schedules. They moved when the aircraft were absent. They assembled when the surveillance gap was widest. They exploited the darkness between observation windows with the confidence of people who had learned exactly how long those windows were. The Orlan 10 eliminates the window. 16 to 18 hours of continuous observation means that the insurgent commander who learned to move in the surveillance gap discovers that the gap no longer exists. The assembly point that was safe because aerial assets were never overhead long enough to observe it being used is now being monitored through its entire operational cycle. The movement corridor that connected the assembly point to the attack position, invisible during short surveillance windows, is now mapped, recorded, and understood in the command center processing the Orlan's data feed. The hide-and-seek war requires places to hide. The Orlan 10 is systematically eliminating them. But persistent surveillance without the ability to act on what it reveals is an incomplete solution. This is where the Lancet enters the operational picture. The Lancet loitering munition, a precision strike platform that can be held over a target area, updated with targeting data in real time, and directed against a specific point with an accuracy that conventional artillery cannot match in the terrain and engagement conditions of the Sahelian theater, provides the action capability that the Orlan surveillance makes possible. The operational synergy between the two platforms is the core of what Russian technical advisors have introduced to AES military doctrine. The Orlan fights, the Lancet strikes, not with the collateral damage profile of area effect weapons that have historically made civilian harm an unavoidable feature of counter-terrorism operations in populated areas, with the precision that allows a strike to be directed against a specific vehicle, a specific position, a specific piece of infrastructure, in an environment where the distinction between combatant and civilian matters enormously for the community relationships that determine long-term security outcomes. The psychological impact of this precision on armed groups operating in the tri-border zone is documented and significant. A combatant who has spent years operating in terrain that he believed made him invisible, who has survived by moving fast, dispersing quickly, and trusting the vastness of the desert to absorb his movement, discovers that the desert is no longer empty. It is watched. Every vehicle movement, every assembly, every transit through a corridor that was previously safe because no surveillance asset stayed over it long enough to see it used twice. The sanctuary that the Sahelian landscape provided for a decade of insurgent operations is being systematically dismantled from above, and that dismantling is producing a psychological effect that compounds the physical impact of the strikes themselves. Armed groups that cannot find safe ground, that cannot assemble, transit, or position without the risk of observation and precision response face a strategic dilemma that changes their operational calculus fundamentally. Disperse and lose the coordination that makes complex operations possible, or concentrate and become visible to platforms that can respond before the concentration can execute. There is no third option in an environment where persistent surveillance has eliminated the gap between observation and action. But the transformation of the Sahelian operational environment in 2026 extends beyond the physical strike capability of precision platforms. It extends into the electromagnetic spectrum, and this is the dimension of the new AE's defense architecture that outside observers have been slowest to understand and that insurgent groups have found most disorienting. Russian supplied electronic warfare suites are operating across the tri-border zone in ways that are invisible to anyone not specifically looking for their effects. But the effects are documented in the changed behavior of armed groups that previously coordinate complex ambushes through radio networks, commercial communications technology, and the kind of improvised signals infrastructure that a decade of operational experience taught them to build and maintain in the field. That infrastructure is being neutralized. Jamming technology that disrupts the specific frequency ranges used by insurgent communication networks, without the broad spectrum interference that would also disrupt civilian communications, and the AES forces' own systems is creating what planners call silent zones, corridors of territory where government forces can maneuver with complete signals privacy, where the coordination that allows AES rapid response units to move from surveillance alert to intercept position is invisible to the armed groups they are responding to, where the ambush that requires communication between multiple elements to execute cannot be coordinated because the communication infrastructure it depends on is not functioning. An ambush that cannot be communicated cannot be coordinated. An uncoordinated ambush is not an ambush. It is a dispersed group of individuals making independent decisions in an environment where the information advantage has reversed completely. The information environment that insurgent groups owned for a decade is being reclaimed, not through the presence of foreign intelligence assets whose data stays in foreign systems, through indigenous capability integrated into AES command structures operated by AES personnel, generating intelligence that flows to AES commanders and stays within AES systems. This is data sovereignty as a defense pillar, and it represents the most consequential break with the previous foreign partnership model that the AES transition has produced. Here is the strategic reality that the transition to precision technology has revealed, and that neither the AES nations nor their Russian partners fully anticipated before the operational data started coming in. The technology advantage is self-compounding. Every OLAN surveillance flight generates data that improves the targeting accuracy of the next one. Every Lancet strike against a confirmed position generates post-strike assessment data that refines the understanding of how armed groups respond to precision engagement. Every electronic warfare operation against insurgent communication infrastructure generates signals intelligence about the backup systems and alternative frequencies that groups shift to when their primary networks are disrupted. The system learns, not in the artificial intelligence sense, though elements of the data processing infrastructure incorporate machine learning components that improve pattern recognition over time. In the operational sense, the AES command centers processing the data from these platforms are developing an understanding of the specific armed groups operating in their areas of responsibility, their movement patterns, their assembly rhythms, their communication behaviors, their response protocols that previous intelligence methods could not generate. This accumulating operational intelligence is what allows the transition from reactive to proactive operations. Previous counterterrorism in the Sahel was almost entirely reactive. Armed groups attacked, military units responded. The response almost always arrived too late because the information that would have enabled earlier positioning was not available. The persistent surveillance and electronic monitoring architecture being built across the tri-border zone in 2026 is generating the predictive intelligence that makes proactive positioning possible. AES units are beginning to be where attacks are coming from before the attacks are launched, not because of prediction algorithms, because of the accumulated pattern recognition that continuous surveillance of specific groups in specific terrain generates over operational time. The military that owned the information environment was always going to win this conflict. The AES is becoming that military. The Battle of Anefis tells a story that the tri-border zone's armed groups are still processing. Pharma does not just defend Anefis, it takes it. And while the engagement is ongoing, while the outcome is still being determined on the ground, fresh shipments of VN2C and VN22B armored platforms arrive in country. 30 VN2C units, 18 VN22B, logistics vehicles, ammunition, the resupply of a military that is not managing a crisis but executing a campaign, a military that wins a major engagement and immediately prepares for the next phase, does not look like a force under pressure. It looks like a force with a plan, and the plan, the integration of persistent aerial surveillance, precision strike capability, electronic warfare dominance, and the armored mechanization that allows ground units to exploit the intelligence advantages the aerial layer generates is a blueprint that extends far beyond the immediate operational priorities of the AES theater. It is a demonstration model, the first African military architecture that integrates these capabilities indigenously, operated by African personnel, controlled through African command structures, generating intelligence that stays within African borders, will establish the template that other African nations seeking to modernize their security apparatus will study, adapt, and implement. The rifles to robots transition happening in the Sahel in 2026 is not just a regional security development. It is a continental proof of concept for autonomous African defense. There is a drone operator at an AES command center right now watching a feed that his counterpart from 5 years ago could not have imagined. A continuous high-resolution view of a movement corridor that armed groups used freely 18 months ago. Thermal imaging that distinguishes vehicle heat signatures from ambient temperature at distances that make visual detection from the ground impossible. A data overlay that correlates current movement with archived patterns from previous surveillance cycles. He is not waiting to react to an attack. He is watching the indicators that his accumulated operational experience tells him precede an attack, and his rapid response unit is already moving to the intercept position that the electronic mapping of the corridor has identified as the optimal point of interdiction. The bolt-action era could not produce this moment. The era of the rifle, of ground-level patrols in predictable patterns, of surveillance windows that insurgents scheduled their operations around, of intelligence that flowed to foreign command centers rather than to the African commanders fighting the war, could not produce this moment. Only the rifles to robots transition produces this moment. A Sahelian military thinking in 3 dimensions, owning the information environment, operating with precision against a confirmed position, rather than searching an empty landscape for an enemy that has already moved. The foreign boots that spent a decade in this theater and left it more contested than they found it could not produce this moment either. Only African hands on African platforms, processing African intelligence, executing African operational doctrine produce this moment. The Sahel is not waiting to be defended from outside anymore. It is defending itself from above with precision, with patience, with the accumulated operational intelligence of a military that has learned finally, irreversibly, to think in 3 dimensions. The bolt-action era is dead. The era of autonomous African defense is operational, and the Bulletin will be here for every engagement it wins. Like this video. Subscribe to the Bulletin, share this with every African who needs to understand that the most sophisticated military transformation on the continent is happening right now, not in a defense ministry briefing room, but in the skies above the tri-border zone. The next chapter of this story is already airborne. We will not miss its landing.